Somewhere in Ice Age Europe, a species with no fur, no claws, and no natural defense against cold, somehow chose to live at the exact edge of where a human body can survive at all, and thrived there. Strip away your clothes, your house, your blanket, and stand outside in -30 degrees, completely naked. No fur, no fat layer built for this, no fangs, no claws, nothing evolution gave you specifically for cold. By every reasonable measure, you should already be dead, and so should every ancestor who came before you. And yet somewhere, on the coldest, most unforgiving stretch of Ice Age Europe, humans were not just surviving. They were building homes, sewing tailored clothing, and burying their children beneath thousands of carved ivory beads. This is the part of the Ice Age story almost nobody tells correctly, and it starts with something almost absurd. A house built entirely out of the bones of a single, enormous animal, the woolly mammoth. Across Eastern Europe, archaeologists have uncovered circular dwellings over 20,000 years old, built from mammoth remains. Skulls stacked as a foundation, massive leg bones curved and interlocked to form the frame of the structure, tusks arched overhead like ribs, holding the entire shape together against wind that could kill an unprotected person in hours. Hides and turf were layered over that bone skeleton, sealing gaps, trapping precious warmth against the coldest nights imaginable. Building one of these required more than a single strong person with a good idea and free time. It required a mammoth carcass, coordinated planning, and enough people willing to work together toward a shared, freezing deadline. This was architecture, built with nothing but the largest available materials and an unwillingness to simply lie down and die. But shelter alone does not explain how a hairless primate outlasted an ice age that killed off far tougher species. The real turning point may be smaller than a mammoth bone hut, and far easier to overlook entirely. A needle, carved from bone, barely larger than a matchstick, with a tiny hole drilled through one end. Sewing needles like this appear in the archaeological records starting around 40,000 years ago, and they changed everything. Before the needle, clothing meant draping a loose hide over your shoulders and hoping the wind cooperated. After the needle, clothing meant something entirely different. Fitted, layered, wind-resistant garments built for a specific, freezing purpose. Bear and reindeer pelts were scraped clean, using specialized stone tools, removing fat and tissue that would otherwise rot. Then those hides were cut, precisely, into shapes. Sleeves, leg coverings, hooded panels built to trap body heat. Thread came from wild flax and other plant fibers, twisted by hand, sometimes even dyed in shades of turquoise and pink. This was not survival clothing in the crude sense most people imagine when picturing early humans wrapped in animal skins. This was tailoring, functionally identical in purpose to the technical outerwear built by engineers in laboratories today. Multiple layers, each one serving a distinct function, stitched together by hands, working in temperatures that could stop a heart. And fire tied every part of this system together, the same way it always had. Deep into human history, Ice Age humans tended fires with obsessive, practiced care, because losing one could mean losing everything within hours. They carried embers, wrapped carefully when moving camp, refusing to risk starting entirely from nothing in brutal, open cold. They stored dry fuel inside their shelters deliberately, anticipating storms before those storms had even begun to form. Flint and pyrite, the tools used to spark a flame from nothing, were treated as genuinely precious personal possessions. Losing your fire-starting kit in this environment was not a minor inconvenience. It was a slow, freezing emergency. Now take fire, shelter, and tailored clothing, and combine them inside one specific, remarkable archaeological site. Near modern-day Moscow, at a place called Sunghir, archaeologists uncovered something that rewrote assumptions about Ice Age life entirely. The site dates back roughly 34,000 years, deep into one of the coldest, harshest periods humans ever endured. Excavated between 1957 and 1977, it revealed skeletons covered in something almost impossible to imagine surviving that era. More than 13,000 beads, carved painstakingly from mammoth ivory, arranged in careful, deliberate rows across the remains. Their placement was not random. Researchers realized these beads once decorated fitted garments, stitched directly into the fabric itself. By studying exactly how the beads had fallen and clustered, researchers reconstructed entire outfits, piece by piece, centuries later. A shirt without a single visible seam cut. Trousers connected directly to attached footwear in one continuous garment, possibly something resembling a raincoat. A decorated hat, adorned with beads and drilled fangs pulled from Arctic foxes. This was not crude animal skin wrapping. This was sophisticated, weatherproofed fashion, built specifically to survive extreme, sustained cold. And the burials at Sunghir reveal something even stranger than the clothing itself, something almost unbearably human. One adult male was buried covered in beads and red ochre pigment, a clearly significant, ceremonial act of respect. Nearby, two children, roughly 10 and 12 years old, were buried head to head, facing one another in death. Around them, more than 10,000 mammoth ivory beads, over 20 carved armbands, roughly 300 pierced fox teeth, 16 spears, carved entirely from mammoth ivory. An extraordinary investment of time in objects these children could not possibly need to hunt. Producing thousands of ivory beads alone would have required, by some estimates, thousands of hours of patient, repetitive labor. That labor was spent on two children in the middle of an ice age, when every single hour theoretically mattered for survival. Consider what that decision actually says about the people who made it. Under conditions colder than almost anywhere humans live today, they were not simply scraping by, hour to hour, with no attention left over for anything beyond raw survival. They had systems, fire management, tailored clothing production, architectural planning using mammoth remains, and elaborate, intentional burial ritual. Sunghir is now recognized as the northernmost known Paleolithic settlement of Homo sapiens anywhere on the European continent at that time, which means humans were not simply enduring the absolute edge of livable cold, they were living there, deliberately, with structure. This detail deserves to sit uncomfortably for a moment, because it directly contradicts a very common assumption about the Ice Age. Most people imagine that era as a relentless, grim struggle, every waking hour spent fighting off death by exposure. The archaeological record tells a more layered story: desperate struggle in some seasons, genuine culture and ceremony in others. Somewhere in the coldest stretch of the last glacial maximum, roughly 18 to 20,000 years ago, both realities coexisted. Now return to the original, uncomfortable thought experiment this video began with: your own naked body. Alone, in that same cold. You would not have survived a single night without every single one of these inventions working together in sequence. No fur, no natural insulation, no claws for building, no fangs for defense against anything hunting in that frozen dark. And yet the species that had none of those biological advantages became the one still standing at the end. Not because cold weakened humans less than other species, it should have weakened them significantly more, by every physical measure. Humans compensated entirely through invention: a needle, a shaped hide, a maintained flame, a carefully stacked mammoth bone frame. Each invention alone was fragile, easily lost, easily forgotten if a single skilled person died before teaching someone else. Together, passed down deliberately across generations, they became something close to unstoppable against an entire hostile climate system. This is easy to state as simple historical fact, but it is worth pausing to actually picture the process directly. Someone, generations before Sunghir, first noticed that a loose hide slipped and let cold air directly reach exposed skin. Someone else experimented with piercing that hide, threading a plant fiber through, pulling the gap closed by hand. That first crude stitch likely failed, repeatedly, before anyone refined it into something reliable enough to trust with their life. Multiply that single innovation across footwear, sleeves, hoods, and layered undergarments, refined slowly across countless freezing, patient winters. By the time Sunghir's inhabitants were carving 13,000 ivory beads, that technology had already been trusted for millennia. It had moved far beyond simple survival, becoming sophisticated enough to also carry meaning, status, memory, and grief. The beads on that adult male were not merely decorative. They likely signaled identity, community role, and perhaps ceremonial importance. The beads on those two children were not practical at all. They were something closer to love, rendered in carved ivory. 10,000 beads, 20 armbands, 300 fox teeth, 16 ivory spears. None of it kept anyone warmer that night. It kept something else alive instead, something harder to name directly, something closer to meaning, memory, and communal mourning. That distinction matters enormously because it separates simple animal survival from something distinctly, recognizably human in nature. A wolf pack does not carve ivory beads for a dead pup. A herd does not build an elaborate bone monument. Humans, freezing, exhausted, surrounded by an unforgiving climate, still made time and resources for exactly that kind of gesture. There is a competing hominin species worth mentioning here, because the contrast reveals something important. Neanderthals lived across Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans ever arrived. They were physically better adapted to cold in some respects. Stockier builds, shorter limbs, larger nasal cavities for warming air. Yet Neanderthals appear to have relied mainly on draped, unfitted hides rather than tailored, layered clothing systems. Archaeological sites linked to Neanderthals show far fewer eyed needles and almost no evidence of complex multi-layered garments. Homo sapiens, arriving later, brought exactly the opposite approach. Fitted seams, multiple insulating layers, and specialized tools for sewing. Some researchers argue this technological gap, not raw physical toughness, may have mattered enormously during the coldest climate swings. A tailored garment traps a layer of warm air directly against skin, dramatically outperforming a loose hide draped over the shoulders. That difference, repeated night after freezing night, across an entire population, could compound into a serious survival advantage over time. Neanderthals eventually disappeared from the fossil record roughly 40,000 years ago, during a period of extreme climate instability. Homo sapiens continued expanding across the very same landscape, through the very same brutal conditions, largely unaffected in the same way. This is not a simple single-cause explanation, and serious researchers remain genuinely cautious about overstating it. Climate shifts, competition for resources, and small population sizes likely all played some meaningful role in that outcome as well. But clothing technology remains one of the more compelling threads researchers continue to investigate directly. It suggests something specific. Surviving an ice age was never only about the body a species happened to inherit. It was also about the tools, techniques, and technology a species was willing and able to invent collectively. Now consider another site, roughly contemporary with Sunghir, far to the south in what is now the Czech Republic. At Dolní Věstonice, archaeologists uncovered evidence of something remarkable: deliberately fired ceramic figurines, dating back roughly 26,000 years. This predates the conventional timeline most people associate with pottery. by an enormous, almost implausible margin. Small clay figures, including the famous Venus of Dolny Viestenice, were shaped by hand and hardened intentionally, using controlled fire. Producing usable fired ceramics requires understanding kiln temperature, clay composition, and timing, refined through careful, repeated experimentation. This was happening in a freezing landscape, among people who also needed to hunt, sew clothing, and maintain shelter daily. Art, technology, and raw survival were never separate categories to these communities, competing for scarce, limited attention. They were tightly interwoven activities, each one reinforcing the conditions that made the others possible in the first place. A warm, well-organized shelter created space for someone to experiment patiently with fired clay without freezing before finishing the attempt. A reliable food supply created enough surplus time for someone else to carve thousands of ivory beads for a child's burial. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened without deliberate, sustained cooperation across an entire community. Now consider diet, because staying warm required far more than clothing and shelter working together in isolation. Ice Age humans relied heavily on fat-rich meat, including bone marrow, extracted carefully using specialized percussion tools. Fat provided dense, portable calories, essential for generating internal body heat during the longest, coldest stretches of winter. Mammoth, reindeer, and horse remains at these sites show clear evidence of deliberate, systematic marrow extraction, not incidental scavenging. Nothing appears to have gone to waste. Bones for shelter, hides for clothing, fat for calories, ivory for beads and tools. This total, integrated use of a single animal carcass reflects an economy built entirely around surviving extreme scarcity. Waste was not simply wasteful in this environment. It was potentially lethal, measured in calories a community could not afford to lose. Modern audiences sometimes imagine Ice Age life as scattered, disorganized survival, driven purely by desperate, moment-to-moment instinct. The physical evidence argues for something closer to a coordinated economy, planned carefully around brutal, unforgiving seasonal cycles. Every resource had multiple uses. Every skill had to be taught deliberately, because failure carried consequences measured in human lives. Now widen the lens across the entire continent, because Sunghir was never an isolated exception standing entirely alone. Similar mammoth bone structures appear at multiple sites across Ukraine and neighboring regions, spaced out across thousands of years. Similar tailored clothing technology appears wherever Ice Age humans pushed furthest into brutally cold, unforgiving northern territory. The pattern repeats itself with startling consistency. Fire, shelter, tailored clothing, and ritual appearing together, site after site. This was not one lucky group stumbling onto survival by pure accident in one specific, fortunate location. It was a repeatable, teachable system, refined and carried forward, region by region, generation after freezing generation. Every piece depended entirely on cooperation, because no single person could master fire-making, hide preparation, bead carving, and hunting simultaneously. Someone specialized in preparing hides. Someone else specialized in carving beads with painstaking, repetitive precision. Someone else maintained the fire, feeding it exactly enough fuel through the longest, darkest, most dangerous nights of the year. That division of labor, quietly coordinated without any written instruction, may be as important as any single individual invention. It meant knowledge did not have to live inside one person's memory, vulnerable to being lost the moment that person died. It could be distributed, shared, and rebuilt collectively, even after individual tragedy struck, as it inevitably did during Ice Age winters. Now think again about those two children at Sunghir, buried head to head beneath thousands of carved ivory beads. Whatever killed them, The community response was not simply burial and moving on as quickly as circumstances allowed. It was an outpouring of resources, hours of labor, valuable materials, and collective attention in the depths of an unforgiving winter. That response required a level of surplus, planning, and social cohesion most people do not associate with Ice Age life at all. It suggests a community secure enough in its systems to spend resources on meaning, even during humanity's harshest recorded climate. Consider what a modern comparison might look like, stripped of all the technology available in daily contemporary life. Imagine losing electricity, heating, and manufactured clothing entirely, indefinitely, during the coldest months your region has ever recorded. Most modern people would struggle to survive a single week under those exact conditions, let alone build and maintain a functioning society. Ice Age humans did this for generations, in temperatures colder than almost anywhere populated on Earth today, without any modern infrastructure. They did not simply endure it, they industrialized survival itself, turning bone, ivory, hide, and fire into a functioning system. That system was resilient enough to leave behind children's graves, layered with thousands of hours of careful, deliberate craftsmanship. It is tempting to imagine Ice Age humans as primitive, one crisis away from extinction at every single moment. The archaeological record argues for something closer to the opposite conclusion, at least by the time Sunghir was inhabited. These were skilled specialists, coordinated communities, and grieving parents, operating inside one of the harshest climates humans have ever faced. Return, one final time, to that opening image. Your own body, alone, unprotected, standing in brutal, negative-degree cold. Everything separating you from that fate did not arrive through evolution reshaping your body to withstand the climate directly. It arrived through a needle, through a stitched hide, through a maintained flame, through mammoth bones stacked into a livable frame. It arrived through people willing to spend thousands of hours carving beads for children who would never wear them warm. None of that was inevitable. None of it was guaranteed by biology alone, the way thick fur guarantees warmth for other species. It was built, deliberately, generation after generation, by people who refused to let an entire ice age decide the outcome for them. And by the time the ice finally retreated, the descendants of those same people had already spread across the entire globe. Not because the climate eventually forgave them, because they never waited around for forgiveness in the first place.